Throughout the untamed expanse of the American West, legends often wore unexpected faces. Some of the deadliest men carried their reputations like badges, while others buried their past beneath layers of careful deception. But perhaps no legend was more carefully crafted than that of Silent Hand Stevens, the man who could draw faster than a rattler's strike and shoot straighter than God's judgment. Some said he'd killed 20 men in a single gunfight outside Santa Fe. Others claimed he'd faced down the entire Dawson gang with nothing but a borrowed pistol and nerves of steel. A man who, for reasons known only to himself, chose to vanish at the height of his notoriety, leaving behind whispered tales and empty graves. Few connected those blood-soaked stories to the gentle-spoken puppeteer who appeared one scorching afternoon in the dusty streets of Copper Creek, Arizona Territory, 1875. His weathered wagon, painted in faded blues and golds that had almost surrendered to the relentless desert sun, creaked to a halt outside the town's only saloon, the Iron Spur. The man who climbed down wore a threadbare coat despite the heat, his graying hair tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better days. A collection of intricately carved puppets hung from strings inside his wagon, their wooden faces frozen in eternal performances. A dancer in mid-pirouette, a clown with an ever-present smile, and most notably, a gunslinger with his tiny pistol pointed perpetually skyward. Join me today as we delve into the story of how a single afternoon in Copper Creek would strip away one man's carefully constructed facade, forcing a legend to step back into the light. If you find yourself captivated by this tale, make sure you're subscribed to our channel, because tomorrow's story about the ghost marshal of Dead Pine will haunt your dreams. Now let's return to that fateful day in Copper Creek. The puppeteer, who introduced himself simply as Thomas Grace, had chosen Copper Creek for its position at the crossroads of two major trading routes. Where there were travelers, there were audiences, and where there were audiences, there were coins to be earned. The town itself was typical of the territory. A dusty main street lined with weather-beaten buildings, a general store with a permanently crooked sign, and the Iron Spur saloon, whose batwing doors had witnessed more violence than most battlefield. Surgeons. What Grace hadn't counted on was the Haskell gang having the same idea about the town's strategic location. Bart Haskell and his brothers had been using Copper Creek as a way station between their robberies, their reputation for casual cruelty keeping the local sheriff perpetually looking the other way. They'd already killed 2 men this month, a card player who won too much and a stage driver who'd made the mistake of reaching for his shotgun. The sight of the puppet wagon sparked their interest on what had otherwise been a brutally dull afternoon. "Well, look what we got here, boys," Bart drawled, pushing away from the saloon's porch post where he'd been lounging. His spurs rang against the wooden planks as he moved, a sound that had become a warning bell to the townsfolk. A genuine artist come to grace our humble town. His younger brothers, Seth and Wade, sniggered at the mock-fancy accent, their hands resting casually near their holsters. The mid-afternoon sun cast their shadows long across the street, like dark fingers reaching for Grace's wagon. Thomas. Grace turned slowly, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Those who knew to look for such things might have noticed how his eyes catalogued every detail. The distance to each brother, the way Wade favored his left leg from an old injury, the slight tremor in Seth's gun hand that spoke of too much whiskey too early in the day. But his face revealed nothing beyond mild concern, weathered features arranged in an expression of polite attention. Sheriff Cooper, watching from his office window across the street, felt an inexplicable chill despite the heat. Something in the stranger's stance tugged at his memory, though he couldn't place why. He'd been sheriff here for 15 years, seen all manner of men come and go, but something about this puppeteer was different. The way he moved, the way he held himself, it reminded him of something he'd seen before, something that danced just at the edge of recognition. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," Grace replied, his voice soft but carrying clearly in the hot afternoon air. "I'm just passing through, looking to put on a small show for any children in town." He gestured to his puppets, their strings swaying gently in the desert breeze. Behind him, the wooden Gunslinger puppet seemed to watch the proceedings with its painted eyes, its tiny fingers forever frozen on its miniature trigger. "Ain't seen no real entertainment in weeks," Bart continued, moving closer to inspect the wagon. The floorboards of the sidewalk creaked under his weight as he approached, his shadow falling across the detailed paintings on the wagon's side. "Might be fun to see what kind of show you can put on." His grin suggested he had something other than puppet theater in mind. "How about a special performance right now?" Grace's fingers brushed against the Gunslinger puppet, a gesture so subtle it might have been unconscious. The puppet's strings trembled slightly, catching the harsh Arizona sunlight. "I prefer to have a proper stage set up," he said quietly. "Helps maintain the illusion." Inside the Iron Spur, conversations had died away as patrons pressed closer to the windows, their breath fogging the dusty glass. They'd seen the Haskell brothers' idea of entertainment before. Last month, they'd made a traveling salesman eat his own patent medicines while they shot at his feet. The man had survived barely, but his mind hadn't been quite right since. "Oh, we ain't interested in no illusions," Seth called out, emboldened by his brother's lead and the whiskey burning in his belly. "Want to see what you can do with them strings while dancing yourself?" His hand drifted closer to his gun, fingers twitching with anticipation. A thin sheen of sweat had broken out on his forehead, despite the shade of the saloon's overhang. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees, despite the merciless Arizona sun. Grace stood perfectly still, only his eyes moving as he studied the three brothers. When he spoke again, something had changed in his voice, a hardness beneath the gentle tone that made Sheriff Cooper's spine tingle with recognition. "Some shows," Grace said softly, "are best left unperformed." His hand still rested on the Gunslinger puppet, but now the touch seemed more purposeful, almost like a man might rest his palm on a trusted weapon. Old Man Jenkins, sweeping his store's porch across. The street froze mid-motion. He'd lived in the territory for 40 years, seen his share of killers and hard men. Something in the puppeteer's stance sent his ancient instincts screaming. He quietly began backing toward his door. Bart Haskell, too drunk on whiskey and his own reputation to recognize the warning signs, took another step forward. His spurs jangled discordantly against the wooden planks. "Ain't giving you a choice, puppet man. Dance for us, or we'll see how well you perform with some extra holes in you." A tumbleweed rolled lazily down the street, the only movement in a scene frozen in anticipation. Even the ever-present desert wind seemed to hold its breath. Inside the saloon, someone whispered a quiet prayer. "I've found," Grace said, his voice barely above a whisper now, "that men who force others to dance often end up performing their own final jig." His eyes, previously mild and unthreatening, had taken on a different quality. They reminded Sheriff Cooper of a mountain lion he'd once encountered, patient, calculating, utterly lethal. Wade Haskell, the youngest of the brothers, felt the first stirring of unease. Something about the puppet man had changed, like a mask slowly slipping away to reveal something dangerous underneath. "Bart," he started to say, "maybe we should—" "Shut your mouth," Bart snarled, his ego now fully invested in the confrontation. "I ain't backing down from some traveling show freak." He took another step forward, boot heels thudding heavily against the wood. "Last chance, old man. Dance, or me and my brothers will give these good folks a different kind of show. One involving lots of red paint, if you take my meaning." Grace's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the puppet's strings. "The thing about puppet shows," he said softly, "is that someone always has to pull the strings." His other hand hung loose at his side, deceptively relaxed. The real question, Mr. Haskell, is who's pulling yours? The air grew thick with tension as Copper Creek held its breath, unaware it was about to witness the first act of a performance that would be whispered about in saloons across the territory for years to come. A performance that would remind everyone why some legends are best left undisturbed. Sheriff Cooper's memory finally caught up with him as he watched the scene unfold outside his window. 6 years ago, he'd witnessed a gunfight in Tucson that still haunted his dreams. A man they called Silent Hand Stevens had faced down 4 members of the Morgan clan, men who'd built their reputation on speed and accuracy with a gun. The fight had lasted less than 10 seconds. What stayed with Cooper wasn't just the shocking speed of Stevens's draw, but the way he'd stood before it happened. That same patient, unnatural stillness he now saw in the puppeteer. "You got a smart mouth for a man about to die," Bart Haskell growled, his face flushing red with anger. The whiskey and midday heat had shortened his already volatile temper. "Might have just made you dance before, but now I'm thinking we'll start by breaking those pretty puppets of yours. Boys!" Wade and Seth spread out instinctively, moving to flank the wagon. They'd done this dance before, dozens of times with other travelers who'd caught their brother's attention. But something felt different this time. The usual fear was missing from their target's eyes, replaced by something that made Wade's throat go dry. Inside the Iron Spur, old Jim Curtis, the bartender, had lived in Copper Creek long enough to recognize the signs of impending violence. Silently, he began moving, his more expensive bottles below the bar. The last time the Haskells had started something, 3 windows and half his inventory had been destroyed. "The puppets," Grace said quietly, his hand still resting on the wooden gunslinger, "were a gift from a Cajun craftsman down in Louisiana. Man named Baptiste Leblanc." His voice carried clearly in the tense silence. "Spent a month learning his art, watching him bring wood to life with nothing but careful hands and patient skill." Bart took another menacing step forward, but something in Grace's voice made him hesitate. The puppet man was too calm, too controlled, like a rattlesnake coiled and ready, giving its warning before the strike. "Baptiste had a theory about art," Grace continued, his eyes never leaving Bart's face. "Said every piece of wood already knows what it wants to be. The artist's job is just to help it find its true nature." His fingers moved almost imperceptibly along the puppet's strings. "Same could be said about men, I suppose. Strip away the facades, the pretenses, and what's left is their true nature." Seth's hand had nearly reached his gun when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The puppet man's stance had shifted, so slightly it was almost invisible. But in that tiny change, Seth suddenly recognized what had been nagging at his whiskey-addled mind. He'd seen gunfighters before, many of them. The good ones, the truly dangerous ones, all had that same quality, the ability to appear relaxed, while being perfectly positioned to draw and fire. "Bart!" Seth called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Something ain't right about this." "I said shut up!" Bart roared, his patience finally snapping. His hand dropped to his gun. "Time to see what a puppet looks like with its strings cut." What happened next would be debated in saloons across 3 territories, each telling slightly different, but all agreeing on one thing: they'd never seen anything like it. Grace's transformation from mild-mannered puppeteer to something else entirely happened in the space between heartbeats. The wooden gunslinger puppet dropped from suddenly empty fingers as Grace's hand moved with supernatural speed. Light glinted off the Colt appearing in his grip, seemingly materializing from nowhere. The first shot caught Bart's gun before it could clear leather, sending it spinning away in a spray of blood and splintered wood. In that frozen moment, as the echo of the shot rolled down Copper Creek's main street, Sheriff Cooper saw what he'd been dreading. The mask of Thomas Grace, gentle puppeteer, had fallen away completely. Standing in his place was a ghost from the past, a legend they'd all thought long dead. Silent Hand Stevens had returned to the land of the living, and his performance was just beginning. Time seemed to slow as Bart Haskell stared at his shattered gun hand, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Blood dripped onto the sun-bleached boards beneath his feet, each drop falling with the weight of a lifetime spent building. A reputation that was about to come crashing down. Seth and Wade stood frozen, their own weapons half-drawn, caught in that dangerous space between action and hesitation. The stories about Silent Hand Stevens had reached even their ears. Tales of a man who could put 5 bullets through the same hole at 50 paces, who'd once disarmed an entire posse without taking a single life. "That's one, Grace. Now, revealed as Stevens," said softly. The Colt in his hand hadn't moved, its barrel steady as a mountain ridge. "I'd suggest you boys think very carefully about what happens next. Unlike your brother, you still have a choice." Inside the Iron Spur, old Jim Curtis had ducked behind his bar, but he kept his eyes fixed on the scene through a gap between whiskey bottles. In 40 years of tending bar in the territories, he'd seen his share of gunfights, but something about this one felt different. The usual chaos and bravado were absent, replaced by something more surgical, more precise. "You're dead," Bart snarled through clenched teeth, cradling his ruined hand. "You hear me, Stevens? You're a goddamn dead man." But there was fear in his voice now, the kind that comes from realizing you've been playing at being the wolf only, to find yourself face to face with a mountain lion. Wade, the youngest, had always been considered the smartest of the Haskell brothers. He saw the writing on the wall and began slowly raising his hands. "Seth," he called out, voice shaking, "do like he says. That's Silent Hand Stevens. Ain't no shame in—" But Seth, driven by a combination of whiskey, fear, and misplaced loyalty, made his choice. His gun cleared leather with impressive speed. He'd practiced that draw 1,000 times in front of a mirror. But Stevens had never stopped moving after his first shot, flowing like water into his next action. 2 more shots rang out. So close together, they almost sounded like one. Seth's gun went spinning away, along with Wade's half-drawn weapon. Neither brother had even managed to point their pistols before being disarmed. The accuracy was supernatural, impossible, yet 4 guns lay in the dust, each with shattered grips and bent barrels, while their owners nursed hands that would never draw straight again. "That's 3 and 4, Stevens remarked, his voice still carrying that same quiet calm. "I always did prefer even numbers." The transformation in him was complete now. Gone was any trace of the gentle puppeteer, replaced by something carved. From the same steel as his gun barrel, Sheriff Cooper had finally snapped out of his shock and was hurrying across the street, his own gun drawn. "Sweet Jesus," he breathed, taking in the scene. 4 shots, 4 ruined guns, and not a single life taken. The stories hadn't done it justice. "Sheriff," Stevens acknowledged without taking his eyes off the Haskell brothers. "Sorry about disrupting your afternoon. These boys seemed eager for a show, so I obliged them." The street had gone deathly quiet, broken only by the pained breathing of the Haskell brothers and the distant cry of a circling hawk. The gathered crowd, pressed against windows and peeking around corners, hardly dared to breathe. They were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. The day a simple puppeteer revealed himself to be one of the most legendary gunmen in the territories. But as Sheriff Cooper moved to take charge of the situation, a new sound cut through the tension, hoofbeats approaching fast from the east. Stevens' eyes narrowed slightly as he turned his head just enough to track the sound. "Might want to hold off on those arrests, Sheriff," he said softly. "If I'm not mistaken, we're about to have company, and unless I miss my guess, they're riding with Carson Kane." The name hung in the air like gunsmoke, and those who recognized it felt their blood run cold. Carson Kane, the man who'd sworn to kill Silent Hand Stevens if it was the last thing he ever did. The man who'd spent 6 years searching for the ghost who'd gunned down his brothers. Sheriff Cooper knew the name Carson Caney well enough to feel his stomach drop. 6 years ago, Caney had lost 3 brothers in a shootout with Silent Hand Stevens outside a Santa Fe bank. The official story was that the Caney brothers had been trying to rob the place. Carson maintained they'd been set up, though nobody ever discovered by whom. What mattered was that Carson Kane had spent the years since then building his own reputation and his own gang, while searching for the man who'd killed his family. "Get these 3 into your jail," Stevens said quietly, indicating the Haskell brothers, "and clear the street. Caney doesn't usually care much about bystanders." The thunder of approaching horses grew louder, punctuated by the jangle of gear and the sharp crack of leather on leather. From his position near the Iron Spur's entrance, Stevens counted at least 8 distinct sets of hoofbeats, more than he'd expected. But then, Carson Caney had never been one to leave things to chance. "You knew," Sheriff Cooper said suddenly, as his deputy began herding the wounded Haskells toward the jail. "You knew Caney would find you here." Stevens's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. "Been leading him on a merry chase for the better part of a year," he admitted. "Needed the right place for our discussion. Somewhere with good sightlines, plenty of cover for civilians, and few approaches." His eyes scanned the street with professional assessment. Copper Creek suited my purposes. The first riders appeared at the east end of the street, sunlight glinting off rifle barrels and badge-like stars pinned to their chests. Carson Caney had taken to having his men wear false badges, a mockery of the law he claimed had failed him. They spread out across the street's width, 8 hard-faced men who moved with the coordination of long practice. In the center rode Carson himself, a tall man with prematurely gray hair and eyes like chips of blue ice. He sat his big bay stallion, with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle, though his right arm hung slightly stiff, a souvenir, those in the know whispered, from his last encounter with Stevens. 6 years, Caney called out, his voice carrying clearly down the suddenly empty street. 6 years I've been looking for you, Stevens. Started to think maybe you really had died, like the stories said. His cold eyes took in the puppet wagon, the fallen guns of the Haskell brothers. "A puppeteer, that's a new one, I'll give you that." Stevens hadn't moved from his position near the saloon, his gun still held loose but ready at his side. "Your brothers drew first, Carson, just like these fellows here." He nodded toward the departing Haskells. "Some men just can't help but dance when they hear the music start playing." "My brothers were good men," Caney snarled, though he made no move for his weapon, not yet. "They weren't robbing that bank. They were meeting an informant, someone who claimed to have proof about who really killed our PA." "That's so." Stevens's voice remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. Interesting timing, them showing up armed and masked just as the bank was moving its monthly shipment. The tension in the street ratcheted up another notch. Caney's men had spread out further, taking positions behind water troughs and hitching posts. Above them, unseen by most, shadows moved across weathered shingles as townspeople with rifles found their own vantage points. Sheriff Cooper's deputy had organized an impromptu militia during previous troubles, and they hadn't forgotten. "Their training—" "You're surrounded, Stevens," Caney said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely confident of that fact. 8 guns to your 1. Even you can't shoot your way clear of those odds." Stevens glanced briefly at his puppet wagon, where the wooden gunslinger still hung motionless among its fellow performers. "Numbers don't matter much in the end, Carson. What matters is the truth. And I think it's time you learned what really happened in Santa Fe." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. For the first time, uncertainty crept into Carson Kane's icy stare. "The truth?" Carson Kane's voice carried a dangerous edge. "I know the truth. My brothers went to that bank because someone sent them a letter, said they had proof about who murdered our father. Next thing I know, they're dead on the bank steps. And you're riding away with smoking guns." Stevens shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving Kane's face. Your brothers got that letter 3 days after I tracked down the real killer of your father, man named Marcus Webb. Ring any bells, Carson?" The change in Caney's expression was subtle but unmistakable. Behind him, several of his men exchanged uncertain glances. The name Marcus Webb carried weight in certain circles. A businessman who'd made his fortune backing mining operations across the territory, though rumors suggested his real profits came from less legitimate ventures. "Webb's dead," Caney said flatly. "Died in a mining accident 4 years ago." "That what you heard?" Stephen's voice remained soft, but it carried clearly in the tense silence. "Interesting, because I was there when he died, Carson. And it wasn't in any mine." His free hand reached slowly into his coat, drawing out a weathered envelope. "Been carrying this for 6 years, waiting for the right moment." Sheriff Cooper, watching from the shelter of his office doorway, saw several of Kane's men subtly adjusting their grip on their weapons. The air felt charged, like the moments before a lightning strike. Above them the sun continued its merciless assault, casting harsh shadows across the street's rutted surface. "Your father wasn't just a rancher, Carson," Stevens continued, holding the envelope loosely. "He was gathering evidence against Webb's operation, proof of claim, jumping, murder, corruption, that went all the way to the territorial governor's office. Webb found out, sent killers to your family's ranch. But your brothers didn't know that part, did they?" Caney's face had gone pale beneath his tan. "You're lying," he growled, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "Webb's men botched the job," Stevens went on relentlessly, "made it look like a random attack by raiders. But your father survived long enough to tell me the truth. I was a marshal then, investigating Webb's operations. Your father was my informant." The revelation hit the street like a physical blow. Several of Caney's men straightened in their saddles, looking at their leader with new eyes. Even the townspeople, watching from windows and doorways, could feel the shift in the air. When I finally caught up with Webb, he was proud of it. Laughed about how easy it had been to manipulate you and your brothers. Said all it took was one forged letter suggesting a different killer, and you boys did exactly what he expected. Went charging off in the wrong direction, leaving him free and clear. Carson Kane's hand had begun to shake slightly where it rested near his gun. The bank, the robbery. Webb arranged that too. He knew I was closing in, needed a way to eliminate loose ends. So he sent another letter to your brothers, promising evidence about your father's death, made sure I knew when and where they'd show up. He played us both, Carson, turned us against each other while he walked away clean. The envelope in Stevens's hand seemed to carry the weight of all those years of deception. This is Webb's confession, written and signed the day I finally caught up with him. Everything's here, names, dates, proof of who really killed your father, proof of how he manipulated your family into a blood feud to cover his tracks. One of Kane's men, a grizzled veteran named Hawkins, spoke up suddenly. "Boss, I knew. Your man was straight as they come. If what Stevens is saying—" "Shut up." Caney's voice cracked like a whip. His face had become a battlefield of emotions. Doubt warring with long-held certainty, grief tangling with rage. "Why?" he demanded of Stevens. "Why wait 6 years to tell me this?" Stevens' answer was interrupted by the sound of more horses approaching, this time from the west end of town. The thunder of hooves was accompanied by the distinctive jingle of government-issued tack. "Because," Stevens said quietly, "I needed to make sure we got all of them, Webb's entire organization. And unless I miss my guess, the last pieces of that puzzle are about to ride into town." The approaching riders emerged from the heat haze at the west end of Copper Creek's main street, 6 men wearing the dark blue coats and brass badges of territorial marshals. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a carefully trimmed mustache, rode slightly ahead of the others. Even at a distance, there was something off about their formation, a predatory quality that didn't match their official appearance. "Right on time," Stevens murmured, still holding the envelope containing Webb's confession. "Carson, take a good look at the man leading them. Name's James Morton. Used to be Webb's chief enforcer before he bought himself a badge. Now he helps clean up loose ends for what's left of the organization." Caney's eyes narrowed as he studied the approaching riders. Something in their bearing must have struck a chord, because his face darkened with recognition. "Morton. I remember that name. He was there at the reading of Webb's will. Said he was an old friend of the family. Webb's dead, but his operation lives on," Stevens continued quietly. "Mining claims are still being jumped, witnesses still disappearing. Morton and his kind just gave it a more official appearance. Been tracking them for years, gathering evidence, waiting for them to lead me to the bigger fish." The false marshals drew closer, their horses' hooves kicking up dust from the sun-baked street. Morton's hand rested casually near his gun, but his eyes showed surprise at finding the street already occupied by Caney's men. This clearly wasn't part of his plan. "Well now," Morton called out, his voice carrying false joviality. "Seems we've stumbled into quite a gathering. Carson Caney and his boys." His eyes found Stevens, and a flash of genuine fear crossed his face before he masked it. "And who might you be, friend?" In answer, Stevens merely smiled and shifted his coat slightly, revealing the distinctive pearl-handled Colt at his hip. Morton's face went pale. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered, "the puppet man. It's been you all along." Sheriff Cooper, still watching from his doorway, saw the pieces falling into place, the mysterious disappearances of Webb's old associates over the past few years, the gradual dismantling of his criminal empire, all of it orchestrated by a simple traveling puppeteer who had been moving across the territory, gathering intelligence and waiting for his moment. "Morton!" one of the false marshals hissed urgently. "That's him! That's Silent Hand Stevens!" The tension in the street ratcheted up another notch as Morton's men spread out, trying to find positions that wouldn't put them in Carson Kane's line of fire. They were caught in the middle now, between Caney's gang and Stevens, with the town's armed citizens watching from above. "Carson," Stevens said calmly, never taking his eyes off Morton. "That letter in Webb's desk, the one that sent your brothers to the bank?" Morton wrote it. Webb's confession names him as the one who came up with the whole plan. Even suggested making sure I'd be there to take the blame. Caney's face had become a mask of cold fury as he turned to study Morton with new eyes. 6 years of hatred, carefully nurtured and directed at Stevens, began to shift toward a new target. His men, sensing the change in their leader, adjusted their positions subtly, covering Morton's group instead of Stevens. "Now, hold on," Morton said quickly, his false confidence cracking. "Whatever he's told you, Caney, it's lies. We can work something out here." His hand was inching toward his gun, but he found himself facing an impossible choice. Stevens on one side, Caney on the other, and no clear way out. Above them, the afternoon sun hung like a molten coin in the cloudless sky, casting harsh shadows across the tableau below. The street had become a powder keg, waiting for the spark that would set it off. And in the tense silence, the soft creak of leather and the nervous shuffle of horses seemed to count down the moments until violence would erupt. Morton's mind raced as he assessed his deteriorating situation. His men were caught in a crossfire, with armed townspeople above and Caney's gang in front. Behind him, the street stretched empty back toward the western edge of town, offering the temptation of escape. But to run would mean turning his back on Silent Hand Stevens, and Morton had seen too many men make that fatal mistake. "Think carefully about your next move," Stevens said softly, his voice carrying in the tense silence. "Webb's confession doesn't just name you as the architect of the bank setup, It details every claim you jumped, every witness you eliminated. Even mentions that fire you started at the orphanage in Yuma to cover your tracks. One of Morton's men, a thin-faced killer named Reeves, suddenly spurred his horse forward. "To hell with this!" he shouted, pulling his rifle from its scabbard. Before he could level it, 3 shots rang out almost simultaneously. Stephen's bullet caught the rifle's barrel, sending it spinning away. Caney's shot took Reeves's hat off, along with a good portion of his carefully oiled hair. The third shot, from one of the townspeople above, knocked the spurs clean off his boot heels. "That's one," Stephen said calmly, his gun having seemingly materialized in his hand without anyone seeing him draw. "Next one won't be a warning." Morton felt sweat trickling down his back, despite the cooling afternoon air. He'd heard stories about Stephen's speed and accuracy, but seeing it in person was something else entirely. The man hadn't even seemed to aim. "Carson," Morton tried one last time, forcing a smile, "you're a reasonable man. Whatever Stevens has told you, I can explain. There's more money in this than you can imagine. The mining claims alone, my father's." "Name," Caney interrupted, his voice cold as mountain snow, "was Michael Andrew Kane. He raised horses, taught Sunday school, and never missed a chance to help a neighbor in need. My brothers were Samuel, David, and Joseph. They died thinking they were avenging him, but it was all a lie." His gun hadn't wavered from Morton's chest. "I've spent 6 years hating the wrong man while you walked free." The street had gone deadly quiet. Even the desert wind seemed to hold its breath. In the distance, a church bell tolled 4 times, the sound rolling across the tense tableau like thunder. Stevens shifted slightly, drawing Morton's frightened attention. "Copper Creek wasn't random, James. I chose it carefully. Railways, coming through next month. Wells Fargo's building a new office. Town's growing. And every piece of documentation about the mineral rights you've been falsifying leads right here." Morton's face went pale as understanding dawned. "The puppet shows," he whispered. "All those performances in mining towns gave me access to record offices, bank vaults, witness statements. Amazing what people will say in front of a simple entertainer." Stevens's smile held no warmth. "The territorial governor's sending investigators next week. Whole operation's about to come crashing down." One of Morton's men, younger than the others, began quietly backing his horse away from the confrontation. Nobody moved to stop him. The false marshal's badge on his chest caught the sun as he turned, a final gleam of fool's gold before he spurred his mount into a gallop heading west. "Let him go," Stephen said, as Morton's eyes followed his fleeing man. "He's riding straight to the real marshal's waiting outside town. Been coordinating with them for months, getting everything in place for today." Morton's last hope of escape crumbled. His remaining men exchanged glances, calculating odds that grew worse by the second. Above them, more armed townspeople had appeared on the rooftops, rifles glinting in the late afternoon sun. The tension reached its breaking point. Morton's hand twitched toward his gun, and the street erupted in violence. What happened next would be debated in saloons across the territory for years to come. Morton's draw was fast, blindingly so, but Stevens's gun seemed to fire before Morton's had even cleared leather. The shot caught Morton's weapon at the perfect angle, sending it spinning away in a shower of sparks and splintered wood. At almost the same instant, Carson Kane's bullet knocked Morton's hat into the dust, while shots from above sent his remaining men diving for cover. The street erupted into chaos. Horses reared and bucked, their riders struggling for control as gunfire erupted from multiple directions. Morton's men scattered like quail, some diving from their saddles to take cover behind water troughs and wagons, others spurring their mounts toward the nearest alleys. But Stevens had predicted this too. "Now, Sheriff," he called out, his voice cutting through the din. On cue, Cooper's deputies emerged from their hidden positions in the alleyways, rifles raised. The fleeing riders found themselves caught in a carefully planned crossfire. Above them, the townspeople's guns kept them pinned down, unable to reach better positions. Morton himself had rolled clear of his fallen horse, scrambling toward the dubious shelter of a nearby freight wagon. His fine marshal's coat was covered in dust, his false badge lying forgotten in the street. 3 of his men had managed to form a defensive position behind a stack of water barrels, their guns splitting their attention between Stevens and Kane's gang. 6 years of planning, Stevens said calmly, walking forward with his Colt held steady. 6 years of tracking every member of Webb's organization, following paper trails, gathering witnesses, building an airtight case. His boots kicked up, small clouds of dust with each deliberate step. "And you walked right into it, James, just like I knew you would." Caney and his men had spread out, covering the street with well-practiced efficiency. They'd spent years working together, and it showed in their coordination. 2 of Morton's men tried to make a break for a nearby alley, only to be driven back by precise shots that kicked up dust at their feet. "You can't kill all of us," one of Morton's men shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "There's too many." The rest of his protest was cut short as Stevens' gun barked once. The man's gun belt fell to the ground, its holster straps neatly severed. Before anyone could blink, 2 more shots rang out, disarming the other men behind, the barrels with similarly impossible precision. "Numbers don't matter much," Stevens replied softly, echoing his earlier words to Caney. "Never did." Morton, realizing the hopelessness of his position, suddenly broke cover and ran toward the saloon's entrance. He managed 3 steps before Stevens fired again. The shot caught Morton's boot heel, spinning him around and dropping him face first into the dust. When he looked up, he found himself staring into the unflinching eyes of Carson Kane. "My father," Caney said quietly, his gun trained on Morton's forehead, "taught us that a man's word was his bond. That honor meant something." His finger tightened on the trigger. 6 years I've lived with the guilt of thinking I'd failed him, that I hadn't avenged him properly. "Carson!" Stevens called out, his voice carrying a note of warning. "He needs to stand trial. His testimony will bring down what's left of Webb's entire operation." The street held its breath. Morton lay trembling in the dust, watching his life balanced on the edge of Kane's trigger finger. Above them, the afternoon sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the scene of justice long delayed. Caney's hand shook slightly, years of vengeful rage, warring with the honor his father had instilled in him. Finally, slowly, he lowered his gun. "You're right," he said quietly. "My father deserves justice, not just revenge." As Sheriff Cooper and his deputies began rounding up Morton's disarmed men, Stevens returned to his puppet wagon. The wooden gunslinger puppet still hung where he'd left it, its painted eyes seeming to watch the proceedings with silent approval. Behind him, the street was coming back to life as townspeople emerged from their shelters, drawn by the spectacle of so many notorious men brought to justice. "You'll testify?" Stevens asked, turning to Caney, who had followed him to the wagon. "About everything Morton told you over the years? The mining claims, the forged documents, the people who disappeared?" Caney nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the envelope containing Webb's confession. "To think I spent 6 years hunting you while the real killers were buying drinks for my brother's memory." His voice carried the weight of time wasted, opportunities lost. How many other families did they destroy? How many other lives did they ruin while I chased the wrong man? "More than you know," Stevens replied, reaching into his wagon to pull out a hidden compartment beneath the puppet stage. Inside lay stacks of documents, witness statements, and carefully detailed maps. "Been gathering evidence from every town I visited. The puppet shows were perfect cover. Nobody pays much attention to a traveling entertainer. They talk freely around someone they think doesn't matter." Old Jim Curtis emerged from the Iron Spur, carrying a bottle of his best whiskey and 3 glasses. "Reckon you boys could use a drink," he said, setting them up on a nearby barrel. Ain't every day we see justice served up quite so neat. As the men poured their drinks, Dr. Bennett was busy tending to the wounded. Most injuries were minor, grazes and splinters from Stephen's impossibly precise shots. The doctor couldn't help but notice how the legendary gunman had managed to end a major gunfight without taking a single life. "The puppet maker," Caney said suddenly, gesturing to the wooden performers. "Baptiste Leblanc. Was that part true, or just another cover?" Stephen smiled slightly, running his fingers over the gunslinger puppet's carved features. "Baptiste was real enough. Spent 6 months with him in Louisiana while tracking one of Webb's men. He really did teach me the art of puppetry." His eyes grew distant with memory. "Said something that stuck with me, that every puppet tells 2 stories, the one the audience sees and the one hidden in the strings." Sheriff Cooper joined them, his face thoughtful as he studied the growing pile of evidence from Stephen's wagon. "Those real marshals you mentioned, when can we expect them?" "Should be here by sundown," Stevens replied, taking a small sip of whiskey. "Been coordinating with them for months, building the case. Morton was the last piece we needed. His testimony, combined with Webb's confession and all this evidence." He gestured to the documents. "It'll be enough to bring down the entire organization, right up to the territorial governor's office." Inside the jail, Morton sat in his cell, his face ashen as he realized the full scope of Stevens's plan. 6 years of careful preparation, all leading to this moment. Every puppet show, every town visited, every seemingly random encounter had been another string carefully woven into a web that had finally snared its prey. "One thing I don't understand," Caney said, studying Stevens over his whiskey glass. "Why keep up the puppet show act even after Morton was caught? Why not just end it there?" Stevens' answer was interrupted by shouts from the east end of town. The real territorial marshals had arrived early, their badges glinting genuine gold. In the late afternoon sun, leading them was a face Caney recognized, Judge Michael Hawthorne, the most incorruptible justice in the territory. "Because," Stevens said softly, watching the approaching lawman, "sometimes the best stories have one final act, one last puppet that needs its strings revealed." His hand rested on the stack of documents, on top of which lay a letter bearing the territorial governor's personal seal. The sun was setting on Copper Creek, but the day's revelations were far from over. Judge Hawthorne dismounted with the fluid grace of a man half his age, his steel-gray hair and weathered face marking him as a veteran of frontier justice. The marshals with him spread out with professional efficiency, securing the area and taking custody of Morton and his men. The judge's keen eyes took in every detail: the discarded false badges, the bullet-marked water barrels, the puppet wagon that had played such an unlikely role in frontier justice. "Well, well," Hawthorne said, approaching Stevens and Caney. "When you said you needed a specific venue for this performance, Stevens, I didn't expect quite such dramatic staging." His voice carried the cultured tones of an educated man, but there was steel beneath the refinement. Stevens nodded respectfully. "Morton's ego wouldn't let him resist the bait, Your Honor. Once he heard rumors that Silent Hand Stevens had been spotted, he had to come himself. Couldn't risk someone else claiming that particular glory." Caney looked between the 2 men, realization dawning. "You know each other?" "Judge Hawthorne," Stevens explained, "was the one who first recruited me to investigate Webb's operation back when I was still wearing a marshal's badge. He's been coordinating with law enforcement across 3 territories, building a case that goes far beyond just land fraud and claim jumping." The judge produced a thick envelope from his coat. "The governor's personal correspondence with Webb," he explained, seeing Caney's questioning look. "Encrypted, of course, but we found the key among Webb's effects after his death. Shows him accepting bribes to look the other way, while Webb's organization systematically looted the territory's resources." Inside the jail, Morton's face had gone from ashen to grey as he watched the judge's arrival through his cell window. "You can't prove anything," he called out, his voice cracking slightly. "It's all circumstantial." "Is it?" Stevens retrieved another document from his wagon's hidden compartment. "This is a ledger we found in Webb's private safe. Shows every bribe, every payoff, every murder sanctioned. Including," he added significantly, "the real reason Michael Caney had to die." Carson Caney stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists. "What real reason?" Judge Hawthorne's face grew grave. "Your father wasn't just gathering evidence about local land fraud, Mr. Kane. He'd uncovered something much bigger. A conspiracy involving not just our territorial governor, but officials in 3 other territories as well. A plan to manipulate the coming railroad contracts worth millions." Stevens spread out a map on a nearby barrel. Every random raid, every mysterious fire, every accident that cleared valuable land. It was all coordinated. They were securing the exact route the railroad wanted, using men like Morton to eliminate any ranchers or homesteaders who wouldn't sell. "My father," Caney's voice trailed off as the full implications hit him, "was a threat to more than just Webb," the judge confirmed. "He had evidence that could have exposed the entire operation. Evidence that, thanks to Stevens' work these past 6 years, we've finally managed to reconstruct." The afternoon light was fading now, casting long shadows across the street of Copper Creek. In his cell, Morton had begun to sweat despite the cooling air. One of the real marshals approached the judge, holding a telegram. "Sir," he said quietly, "word from Santa Fe. They've already arrested 2 territorial judges and the governor's chief of staff. Operations proceeding as planned." Stevens turned to his puppet wagon one last time, his hand resting on the wooden gunslinger. "Like Baptiste said, every puppet tells 2 stories. The one the audience sees." He pulled a hidden lever, and the puppet's chest swung open, revealing a hollow compartment filled with more documents. "And the one hidden in the strings." Judge Hawthorne smiled grimly. "The final act begins. Carson, we'll need your testimony to complete the picture. Ready to help us bring down the men who really killed your father?" But before Caney could answer, another sound cut through the evening air, more riders approaching, this time from both ends of town. And judging by the thunder of hooves, there were a lot of them. The approaching riders emerged from both ends of Copper Creek's main street, at least 20 men from each direction, their horses kicking up clouds of dust in the fading light. Unlike Morton's false marshals, these men made no pretense at legitimacy. They were hired guns, pure and simple, their weapons already drawn and ready. "Right on schedule," Stevens said quietly, seeming unsurprised by this development. "The governor's private army, hand-picked mercenaries kept on retainer for situations exactly like this." Judge Hawthorne quickly began organizing the defense, directing his marshals to take up strategic positions. "Stevens warned us they might come. The governor wouldn't let his operation fall without a fight." The hired guns spread out across both ends of the street, forming a deadly gauntlet. Their leader, a scarred man with an eye patch, urged his horse forward. "This is your one chance," he called out, his voice carrying a thick Texas drawl. "Hand over all the documentation, and we'll let you ride out alive." Governor's willing to be generous considering the circumstances. Inside his cell, Morton had pressed himself against the bars, his face showing equal measures of hope and fear. "Jackson," he shouted to the one-eyed leader, "tell them who sent you. Tell them what happens to people who cross the governor." Stevens calmly began removing his threadbare coat, revealing a custom-made gunfighter's rig beneath. The gun belt held not just his Colt Navy, but a second matching revolver on his left hip. "Carson," he said softly, "still got those skills that made you infamous across 3 territories?" Caney checked his own weapons, a cold smile playing across his face. 6 years hunting, you kept me sharp enough." From the Iron Spur's roof, Sheriff Cooper called down, "Town's with you. Got 20 good men up high with rifles. Just give the word." The one-eyed Jackson spat into the dust. 40 guns against what? A few marshals, some townspeople, and a puppet man? Those ain't odds I'd bet on. Then you don't know who you're facing, Judge Hawthorne replied, his own hand resting on a well-worn Remington. That puppet man is Silent Hand Stevens, the same man who took down the Dawson gang single-handed, the one who ended the Carson. City range war without firing a shot. Stevens stepped forward, his movement drawing every eye in the street. The transformation was complete now. Gone was any trace of the gentle puppeteer. Even Jackson's hardened killers shifted nervously in their saddles at the sight of him. The governor's been playing with puppets for years, Stevens called out, his quiet voice somehow carrying to every ear. Pulling strings, making people dance to his tune, but he forgot something important. His hands hovered near his guns. Sometimes the puppets cut their own strings. Last chance, Jackson warned. But there was uncertainty in his voice now. There's still good money in this for anyone willing to step aside. Gainey moved to stand beside Stevens, his own guns ready. My father died trying to expose this corruption. My brothers died because of it. Think I care about money? The tension stretched like an over-tightened violin string. The setting sun painted. The clouds blood-red above Copper Creek, as if nature itself was preparing for what was to come. Judge Hawthorne's marshals, the armed townspeople, Caney's remaining men, all held their breath, waiting for the spark that would ignite this. Powder keg. One thing about puppet shows, Stevens said softly, his eyes scanning the hired guns with predatory intensity. The audience never sees all the strings. Jackson, you might want to check your men on the south end of the street. Some of them seem a bit distracted. Jackson turned just in time to see half his men on that end suddenly raise their weapons, not at Stevens, but at their fellow riders. The hidden marshals Stevens had positioned during his weeks of preparation had finally revealed themselves. Chaos erupted in the streets of Copper Creek as Jackson's men realized they'd been infiltrated. The one-eyed leader whirled his horse around, trying to make sense of the suddenly shifting allegiances, but Stevens was already moving. His hands became a blur, both Colts clearing leather in a motion too fast for the eye to follow. The guns roared in perfect synchronization, and Jackson's personal weapons, a shotgun and 2 revolvers, went spinning away in pieces. "That's for the widow Brady in Tucson," Stevens said quietly. "The one your men burned out last month on the governor's orders." The street exploded into gunfire. But where previous battles had been chaotic, this one showed the results of Stevens' careful planning. The hidden marshals among Jackson's men opened fire at precisely the right moment, catching their former comrades in a devastating crossfire. Above them, the townspeople's rifles kept anyone from seeking higher ground, while Caney's men demonstrated why they'd earned their reputation as the territory's deadliest gang. "The puppet man planned this all along," Morton whispered from his cell, watching the battle unfold. "Every single step." Judge Hawthorne's marshals moved with military precision, cutting off escape routes and systematically disarming any hired guns who tried to break away. The judge himself proved to be no stranger to combat, his Remington barking out careful shots that seemed to find their marks with uncanny accuracy. 6 years! Stevens called out as he moved through the gunsmoke like a deadly ghost. 6 years of watching the governor's men terrorize innocent people, seeing good men corrupted, honest families destroyed. His guns spoke again and again, each shot precise, each bullet finding weapons rather than flesh. All for railroad money that was never yours to take. Jackson, now disarmed and isolated, tried to rally his remaining loyal men. "Kill him! 50! 1,000 to the man who brings me Stevens' head." But his words died in his throat as he found himself staring down the barrels of Carson Kane's revolvers. "My father died because he believed in justice," Caney said softly. "About time some of that justice came due. The battle was ending as quickly as it had begun. Stevens' careful planning and precise shooting, combined with the element of surprise and superior positioning, had turned what should have been an overwhelming force into a carefully sprung trap. Hired guns who hadn't been disarmed were throwing down their weapons, having no stomach for dying over someone else's corruption. "Check the South Road," Stevens called out to the marshals. "Governor's probably sent reinforcements." But even as he spoke, riders appeared on the ridge above town. More marshals, these led by a face Stevens knew well. "Or perhaps," he added with a slight smile, "the reinforcements are ours." Sheriff Cooper emerged from his office, where he'd been protecting the evidence. "Town secured," he reported. "No casualties among our people. Couple of flesh wounds. Nothing the doc can't handle." He looked at Stevens with newfound respect. "You've been planning this since the day you rode in, haven't you?" "Longer," Stevens replied, finally holstering his guns. Copper Creek wasn't random. Needed a town with good people, strong leadership, and the right location. Somewhere the governor's men would have to come if they wanted to stop us. He turned to Judge Hawthorne. "How long until word reaches the capital?" "Already has," the judge said, holding up a fresh telegram. "Governor tried to flee when he heard about the Santa Fe arrests. Marshals caught him at the territorial line. It's over." The sun had set on Copper Creek, leaving the street illuminated by lanterns and the dying embers of gun smoke. As Stevens walked back to his puppet wagon, Caney followed him. "All this time," Caney said, gesturing at the wagon, "every performance, every town, you were building toward this moment." Stevens reached up to touch the wooden gunslinger puppet, its carved features serene in the gathering darkness. "Like I said, every puppet tells two stories. This one's finally reached its end." But as the adrenaline of battle faded, new questions began to arise. Questions about justice, redemption, and the price of revenge. The night wasn't over yet. As the night settled over Copper Creek, the town began the process of coming to terms with what had happened. The governor's hired guns were secured in makeshift cells throughout the jail and sheriff's office, while Judge Hawthorne's marshals collected statements and catalogued evidence. In the Iron Spur, old Jim Curtis poured drinks for townspeople and lawmen alike, the normal barriers of frontier society temporarily suspended in the wake of shared victory. "What happens now?" Caney asked, watching as Stevens carefully packed away his puppets. The wooden gunslinger was the last to be stored, its painted eyes seeming to hold secrets still untold. After all this is done, after the governor faces justice, what then? Stevens paused in his work, considering the question. "There's more. Corruption out there. More powerful men pulling strings, thinking themselves above the law." His hands moved with practiced care as he secured the puppet in its traveling case. The territory's changing. Railroads coming, bringing money and progress, but also greed and corruption. Judge Hawthorne approached, carrying a stack of official papers. "The government needs men like you, Stevens, men who can work in the shadows, who understand that justice sometimes wears unexpected faces." He held out a marshal's badge, its gold surface catching the lamplight. "The position's yours, if you want it. Official this time." But Stevens shook his head, a slight smile playing at his lips. "Think I'll keep to the puppet shows, Your Honor. Sometimes a man can do more good with wooden actors than with a badge." He turned to Caney. "Besides, seems to me the territory could use some new lawmen, men who understand the difference between revenge and justice." Caney looked at the badge for a long moment, then at his gun belt, the weapon that had been his, constant companion during 6 years of misguided vengeance. With deliberate care, he unbuckled it and laid it across the puppet wagon's seat. "My father," he said quietly, "always told me a man's true character is revealed by the choices he makes when the whole world's watching." His hand reached for the badge. "Reckon it's time I made some new choices." Inside the Iron Spur, Sheriff Cooper was sharing drinks with his deputies and the townspeople who'd helped defend Copper Creek. You know what amazes me, he mused. Not just the shooting, though Lord knows that was something to see. It's how he planned it all. Every detail, every move, right down to choosing our town for the final act. Like one of them fancy chess games. Old Jim agreed, polishing a glass, moving all the pieces into place, waiting for just the right moment. Outside, Stevens had finished packing his wagon. The puppet stage was secured, the hidden compartments holding their damning evidence now, sealed for transport to the territorial capital. But as he prepared to mount up, a small figure darted out of the gathering darkness. Sally Mitchell, the storekeeper's daughter, clutching something in her hands. "Mr. Stevens!" she called out. "You never got to finish your show!" She held up a penny, her small face earnest in the lamplight. "I saved up fair and square." Stevens knelt down to her level, his weathered face softening into the gentle expression that had characterized his puppeteer persona. "Tell you what," he said, taking the penny, but pressing a silver dollar into her hand in return. "Next time I'm through these parts, I'll put on a special show, one about justice and courage and good people standing together against the darkness." As he rode out of Copper Creek that night, the wagon's wheels creaking softly in the darkness, Stevens reflected on the strange paths that life could take. He'd set out seeking vengeance, much like Carson Kane, but had found something more valuable, a way to fight corruption that didn't require him to become what he hunted. The story of the puppet man who brought down a governor's corrupt empire would be told in saloons and around campfires for years to come. Some versions would focus on the gunplay, others on the intricate plan that had taken 6 years to unfold. But the people of Copper Creek would remember something else, that sometimes the greatest legends are born not from violence, but from the patient hands of those who learn to pull the right strings. And somewhere out there on the dusty roads between frontier towns, a black wagon still rolls, carrying a puppet show that tells 2 stories, one for those who come to be entertained, and one for those who need to be reminded that justice wears many faces in the American West.